They said the house on the hill was never meant to have light again. Yet one winter night in 1852, a glow appeared behind its cracked shutters, faint, trembling, and wrong, like a pulse beneath dead skin. The locals of Pine Hollow, Alabama, had long learned to ignore that property. The man who lived there, Master Ellis Ward, had not been seen in years. They called him the Widower of Silence. Some said he spoke to ghosts. Others said he built something in the cellar that could not die. When the light returned, so did the rumors. The first to notice was a farmhand crossing the marsh road after dark. He swore he heard singing, not hymns but women's voices drifting from the hollow in perfect harmony. Yet when he approached the property, the voices fell into silence, and something heavy dragged across the floorboards inside. By morning, 7 women stood on the porch, slaves newly purchased from Montgomery. No one knew their names. No one dared ask. But the strange part was how they arrived, unescorted, barefoot, walking in a line like they'd been summoned, not bought. Within a week, the singing spread through the fields. Sweet at first, then feverish like prayer turned to grief, and when the town minister tried to bless the Ward Plantation, he returned pale and trembling, muttering one phrase that chilled even the drunkards in the tavern. There's no God in that house anymore. The townsfolk of Pine Hollow learned to keep their tongues still. In Alabama, 1852, there were things you didn't question, men with property, land soaked in profit and pain, and names that held the law like scripture. Ellis Ward was one of those names. Before the isolation, he'd been known as a gentleman, educated in Charleston, heir to acres of cotton fields and bodies who worked them. But something happened the year his wife died. The story changed each time it was told. Some said she hanged herself in the parlor. Others swore they saw her body dug from the river days later, hair tangled with weeds. Ward sealed the house that night, dismissed his staff, and vanished into the hollows for nearly a decade. When he returned, no one recognized him. His skin had thinned like paper, his beard gray, his eyes clear but far too still. He went to Montgomery in a black carriage and came back with 7 women, none older than 25. They wore plain linen, walked barefoot, and carried no belongings. At the auction, he'd paid in gold coins that hadn't been minted in decades. Spanish currency, old and heavy, the kind smuggled across the Gulf generations ago. The dealer remembered his hand trembling as he counted. What unsettled everyone most wasn't the purchase, but the way the women moved, each silent, yet somehow breathing in rhythm as if connected by an invisible pulse. When the first night fell, the windows of the Ward house lit with candlelight again. By morning, the nearest farmhand claimed he saw 7 shadows standing in the orchard, staring at the rising sun as if remembering what warmth used to feel like. For a time, the house seemed calm. Smoke rose from its chimney. Lanterns flickered behind the windows. The people of Pine Hollow convinced themselves that Ward had simply returned to a quiet life. Strange, perhaps, but not dangerous. Then came the sounds. Every night near midnight, faint music drifted from the Ward Plantation. It wasn't from instruments, it was the sound of human voices, low and trembling, humming beneath the wind. At first it sounded like hymns, fragments of old field songs, their words tangled with grief. But then came dissonance, moans that grew sharper, harmonies that spiraled upward into something not meant for worship. The pastor, Reverend Keene, led a small group one night to investigate. They crept close enough to hear clearly through the cracked floorboards. What they heard didn't sound like prayer. The voices were chanting names, names of children long dead, names that hadn't been spoken since the fever years. When they returned to town, none of the men spoke of what they'd heard. But 2 days later, Keene's wife found him burning his own Bible in the yard. He wouldn't say why. A few weeks later, a traveling peddler reported something stranger still. While crossing the Ward fields before dawn, he claimed he saw Ellis standing outside barefoot, his shirt open. chest marked with a ring of symbols drawn in ash. The 7 women stood behind him, each holding a candle and humming that same low hymn. The peddler swore that when the first light touched them, the hymn stopped, and the women dropped their candles in perfect unison. The earth beneath their feet, he said, was breathing. When the sheriff finally stepped onto the Ward property, it was not for law but for curiosity. Pine Hollow was small, and every rumor found its way to the courthouse porch. The sheriff, a man named Dugan, claimed he only wanted to see what the fuss was about. He never expected to find the journal. It was discovered in the stables, beneath a broken water trough, bound in leather, its pages soft and swollen from damp. The handwriting inside was Ellis Ward's, neat, disciplined, and increasingly frantic. The first entries were mundane, records of crops, rainfall, and expenses. But then the tone shifted. "There are voices in the soil," one line read. "Not spirits, not memory, among something older. It asks for witness." Further entries grew darker. Ward wrote of hearing singing beneath the house, of dreams in which his dead wife appeared covered in red clay, whispering names he could not pronounce. He mentioned a ritual he'd found in an abolished text, something from before the colonies brought over on ships and hidden by the enslaved as fragments of a forgotten religion. He believed it could restore what he'd lost, not the woman herself, but her presence. "They are vessels," he wrote, "chosen by the song. The body fails, but the rhythm endures." Dugan sealed the journal in his coat and rode back to town without a word. That night he drank until he passed out behind the church. When he awoke, his horse was gone, and in the mud beside his boots were 7 barefoot prints pressed deep, as if the ground had reached up to meet them. 2 months after the sheriff's visit, a stranger arrived in Pine Hollow. She wore mourning black, a veil drawn low over her face, and claimed to be Mrs. Ward. The townsfolk froze. Ellis's wife had been dead nearly 10 years. The woman spoke softly, her accent polished, almost northern. She produced papers from Charleston, stamped and signed, identifying her as Margaret Ward, the same name buried in the churchyard. Reverend Keene refused to meet her eyes. She didn't stay at the inn. Instead, she walked the 4 miles to the plantation on foot, dragging a small trunk through the dust. By dusk, the lights in the Ward house flared brighter than ever, 7 windows burning like watchful eyes. That same night, witnesses saw Ellis standing by the porch rail, his face pale, his expression unreadable, as the veiled woman stepped inside. From that night on, the hymns changed. They grew softer, slower, no longer songs of mourning, but of reverence, as though the voices were welcoming something home. One evening, a child wandering near the orchard saw the woman's silhouette in the upstairs window. Her veil was gone. The boy swore her face was beautiful but wrong, her eyes reflecting light like the eyes of an animal. Days later, the journal reappeared. It was found on the church steps, open to a final page written in fresh ink. She came as promised. The soil remembered her. The living obey. After that, no one saw the Wards again. The fields grew over, the gates rusted shut, but the singing never stopped. Even now, some say that if you walk the marsh road at night, you'll hear 7 voices harmonizing to one, the voice of the woman who returned from her own grave. By the summer of 1853, the Ward Plantation no longer sent cotton to market. No wagons rolled through town, no workers crossed the fields. The ledger showed nothing but silence. Still, Ellis paid his taxes on time, delivered by a single boy, pale and wordless, who refused to say where he'd come from. The mystery deepened when 2 hired servants from a neighboring estate were sent to check on the property. They never returned. Their names were Josiah Boone and Clara Watts, brother and sister, both barely 20. The last person to see them alive was the miller at Pine Hollow Creek. He said they passed by before dawn, carrying lanterns and a bundle of food. They told him they'd been promised work inside the big house, cleaning rooms long shut. 3 days later, the miller found one of their lanterns downstream, Its glass cracked, its flame drowned. The oil inside was mixed with something thick, black and metallic. When the sheriff examined it, he said it smelled like burnt coins. That night, the townsfolk heard the singing again. But this time it was different. The harmony had grown. 9 voices now, not 7. The new tones were off-key, strained, human in their desperation. A traveler passing through claimed he saw figures in the upper windows, spinning in slow circles like dancers. Their shadows moved out of sync with their bodies. By morning, a heavy fog covered the plantation, thick as smoke. When the sun rose, it revealed something that made even the bravest men turn away. Handprints covering the house's outer walls, pressed into the wood, deep enough to splinter it. Each print was burned black. Reverend Keene had been the only man willing to speak openly about the Ward Plantation. After Josiah and Clara vanished, he took it upon himself to bring light to that house. His congregation begged him not to go. They'd seen the change in him since that night beneath the floorboards. The way he kept a lantern burning even at midday. The way he trembled at hymns. But guilt is louder than fear. On a damp August night, Keene walked toward the plantation alone. He left his Bible on the church steps, open to a page smeared with candle soot. The only note he left behind was a single verse, scrawled in a shaking hand. If the earth sings, it sings for the dead. A farmhand claimed he saw Keene approach the porch just as the lamps inside the house blinked out one by one, like a throat swallowing light. Then the door opened without a hand touching it. The Reverend stepped inside and the door closed behind him. No one saw him leave. The next morning, the church bell rang on its own. Inside, the pews were soaked in water, but the floor was dry. At the pulpit lay Keene's lantern. Its wick was still burning, but the flame made no heat. That night, the singing grew louder than ever. 10 voices. No harmony this time, just a slow, deliberate chanting that matched the rhythm of footsteps pacing the floor of the church itself. When the sheriff returned to the Ward property the following week, the front door was wide open. In the parlor, the Reverend's collar hung from the rafters like a trophy. Beneath it, 7 women stood in a ring and smiled. After Reverend Keene's disappearance, something shifted in Pine Hollow. The adults spoke less. The night stretched longer. But it was the children who noticed first, and what they said could never be forgotten. It began with drawings. Crude sketches in the dirt behind the schoolhouse, stick figures in circles, each surrounded by spirals and symbols no child should know. When the teacher, Miss Ruth Allen, asked who had drawn them, every student pointed to the same boy, Thomas Keene, the Reverend's son. Thomas hadn't spoken since his father vanished. He would sit at his desk humming low under his breath, the same tune again and again, slow, steady, identical to the strange hymns from the plantation. One afternoon, Miss Allen followed him as he wandered into the woods. She said he never looked lost, only guided. He stopped at the edge of the marsh and began tracing shapes in the mud, 7 circles connected by a line that curved into the horizon. Then, with a voice too old for his years, he whispered, "They're not buried, they're growing." That night, more children began humming in their sleep. Their parents found them standing at the windows, eyes open, staring toward the Ward property. By the 3rd week, the schoolhouse had to be closed. The walls were covered with more symbols carved deep by small hands. Every morning, new ones appeared, even though no one had been inside. When the sheriff finally went to question Thomas, the boy was gone. On his desk sat a single folded paper, a perfect charcoal sketch of the Ward Plantation under a black sun. At the bottom, in a shaky scrawl, were 4 words, "Mother is coming soon." By autumn, Pine Hollow felt like a town waiting for burial. The crops withered early, the wells soured, and the air itself seemed to hum faintly at night, a low, pulsing vibration that made dogs howl and windows rattle. Sheriff Dugan, gaunt and sleepless, told himself there had to be an answer. He had read every page of Ellis Ward's journal, The entries had begun to shift, not in content but in handwriting. The final pages weren't Ward's at all. They were written in a thin, slanted script that bled through the paper, the ink still wet when he found them. The house remembers. It needs only devotion. 7 seeds, 7 roots. The voice beneath returns through flesh. Dugan rode out alone the next morning. No one followed. He was seen last at the crossroads near the cemetery, muttering scripture and gripping his revolver like a charm against what he could not name. When he reached the Ward house, the front gate was open. The yard was silent. Not a crow, not a breeze. Only the faint, rhythmic sound of breathing coming from somewhere below the soil. At sunset, the townsfolk saw black smoke rising from the property. They thought Dugan had finally burned the place to the ground. But when they arrived, the house still stood, untouched. His horse was found miles away, reins dragging, foam dried to its neck. The saddle was empty except for Dugan's badge, melted and warped as though it had been pressed to fire. That night 11 voices sang. The next morning, the door of the Ward house hung ajar, and on its wooden frame, burned into the grain, was a single handprint, larger than any human's. The morning after the sheriff vanished, the townspeople gathered in the square. No one spoke the word haunting, not out loud, but everyone felt it. The crops had rotted black. The animals refused to drink from the wells, and each night the air carried that same unholy choir. The hymns had grown deeper, slower, and so heavy they seemed to shake the bones inside your chest. It was the blacksmith Jonah Pike who finally broke the silence. "If the law won't end it," he said, "we will." Within hours a mob formed. 15 men armed with rifles, torches, and the kind of courage born only from terror. They reached the plantation at dusk. The gate had fallen away and the house looked almost alive, its shutters trembling in the wind, the ground pulsing faintly beneath their boots. Inside, candlelight flickered through the cracks of the walls, though no one had entered yet. Jonah led the first torch throw. Flames climbed the dry timbers, roaring up the porch posts like veins of fire. But as the men retreated, the impossible happened. The house didn't burn. The fire clung, hissed, then sank inward as though swallowed by the walls themselves. A scream erupted from inside. Not one, but many. The sound made the men drop their rifles and run. Those who looked back swore they saw shapes forming in the smoke. Women's faces, blurred and weeping, staring from the windows. By dawn, the plantation stood untouched again, cold and silent. The torches lay scattered in the grass, their tips melted into glass. And when the men returned to town, every clock in Pine Hollow had stopped at the same time, 3:07 a.m. Weeks after the failed burning, Pine Hollow was no longer a town, it was a wound. Stores closed early, children were sent away to relatives in Mobile, and the church stood locked, its bell rusted silent. Only the Ward Plantation remained unchanged, looming over the marshland like an accusation that refused to fade. Then came the portraits. It was Miss Ruth Allen, the schoolteacher, who found the first one. It appeared overnight in her parlor, hung perfectly straight above her mantel. A woman's face painted in oils, delicate features, dark eyes, mouth slightly open as though mid-prayer. Ruth had never seen her before, but something in the expression made her chest tighten. The brushwork was exquisite, impossibly precise. The signature at the bottom read, E. Ward. The next day another portrait appeared, this time in the postmaster's home. Then another at the tavern. Within a week, 7 portraits had been discovered across town, each depicting a different woman. Their faces shared a resemblance, the same sorrowful gaze, the same faint light reflected in their eyes, as if they were painted by someone who knew them too well. No one saw who delivered them. One night, Ruth took her lantern and studied the painting again. Beneath the varnish, she noticed something, a faint texture that didn't belong to canvas. The surface was too soft, almost porous. When she pressed it lightly, it yielded. She tore a small corner away. The smell hit her first, metallic, sweet, unmistakable. It wasn't canvas at all. It was skin. By morning Ruth was gone. Her house was empty except for the portrait, now showing 8 figures instead of 7. October 12th, 1853. The night the sky turned red. Old diaries from Pine Hollow all mark that same date with the same phrase. The moon bled. For a single evening, the town lay beneath a crimson haze so thick that the air itself seemed to glow. Cattle broke their fences. Chickens tore their own feathers out. And in the silence between screams, the hymn returned, clearer, closer, almost triumphant. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, rising from the soil, the wells, even the river itself. Those who lived nearest to the plantation claimed they saw the Ward house pulsing like a heart, its windows throbbing with red light. It was then that the graves began to open. Witnesses described the ground shifting, as if something beneath was stretching after a long sleep. The first to see it was an old farmer named Willis Crane. He said the earth in his field split apart, revealing the shape of a woman's hand, pale, reaching, twitching in the moonlight. When he tried to help her, the hand sank back into the soil, leaving only the imprint of 7 fingers. By dawn, every cemetery in Pine Hollow had been disturbed. Headstones cracked, soil overturned, and yet no bodies missing. Just deep impressions in the dirt as though something had pressed upward, then thought better of it. That night the red moon returned, and so did the singing. Only now it wasn't distant, it came from inside the town, from behind doors, from beneath beds, from voices that should have been asleep. And for the first time someone recognized the melody. It was the same hymn sung at Margaret Ward's funeral. 3 nights after the blood moon, the orchard behind the Ward Plantation bloomed out of season. The apple trees, barren for years, suddenly burst with pale blossoms glowing faintly in the dark. The scent, sweet and rotting at once, drifted across the marsh, reaching all the way to town. At dawn, a rider passing by saw figures moving among the trees, 8 women dressed in white. They stood in a perfect circle, veils trailing in the mud, hands clasped. At their center stood Ellis Ward, gaunt and trembling, dressed in a black suit that looked decades old. Across from him, Margaret. Her skin was gray, her eyes glassed over, yet she smiled as though seeing paradise itself. In her hands she carried a bundle wrapped in linen. When the rider drew closer, he realized it wasn't a bouquet. It was something small, swaddled, still moving. They were performing a wedding. The preacher's voice, Reverend Keene's voice, echoed from nowhere, his words warped and hollow. The body unites, the soil receives, and the song begins again. Ellis knelt before her. The women hummed that same hymn, their tones so low they rattled the leaves. Margaret pressed the bundle into his arms. For a brief moment he looked up, his face wet with tears, his mouth whispering forgiveness. Then the orchard erupted in light. A single deafening note of song filled the air. By morning nothing remained but scorched blossoms, and in the center of the field, a cradle carved from roots. Inside it, the linen bundle lay still. When the townsfolk dared to approach, they found the fabric empty but damp with something that wasn't blood, something that smelled like earth after rain. Weeks after the orchard burned, a stranger arrived in Pine Hollow, a surveyor from Montgomery, or so he claimed. His name was Elias Thorne, a government man sent to verify property boundaries after reports of a fire. He rode a black horse and carried instruments of brass and glass that clicked and glimmered in the sun. But the townsfolk noticed something strange about him. He asked questions no surveyor should ask. He wanted to know about the hymns, the missing people, the portraits. When told that the plantation had been empty for months, Thorne frowned and said, "No, someone's been sending letters." He produced a bundle of envelopes sealed with black wax. Each one bore the same signature, E. Ward. The letters were addressed to government offices, universities, and even churches across the South. Inside, each contained diagrams, circles, lines, and strange notations resembling both geometry and scripture. Thorne's orders were to investigate. On his third day, he ventured alone to the plantation. The townsfolk warned him not to go after dark, but he only smiled. He believed in reason, not superstition. By evening, the house stood before him, its shutters open as if expecting him. He took measurements of the yard, sketched the layout, and wrote in his ledger, "Ground soft beneath the foundation, audible resonance below surface." He entered the house before sunset. At dawn, his horse was found grazing by the gate. His tools lay scattered, his map soaked through as if dipped in dew. The only page that survived bore a single line, drawn in perfect ink, a spiral descending, ending not in a point, but in an open eye. The townsfolk believed Elias Thorne was dead, swallowed by the same curse that had taken everyone else. But 2 weeks later, his notebook was found nailed to the church door. The pages were soaked, the ink bled, yet some words still clung to the parchment. They read more like confession than record. "There is a spiral beneath the house. Not carved, not dug, grown. The walls pulse. The air hums. It is not a place, but a direction. Down." Thorne described descending into the basement through a trapdoor hidden under rotted boards. Beneath the foundation lay a tunnel, perfectly circular, the earth smoothed as though sculpted by hands long dead. The deeper he went, the warmer the air grew, the walls slick with something like sap or blood. Then came the sound, a heartbeat. He claimed he saw symbols etched into the walls, African, biblical, and something older than either. Each mark glowed faintly when he passed, reacting to his breath. He heard voices, women's voices, singing the same hymn, now soft, coaxing, promising release. "At the spiral's end," he wrote, "there is a chamber shaped like an open mouth. In its center, her." The last page bore a single drawing. 7 figures standing around a pit, their faces lifted toward the ceiling. Above them, the shape of a woman, neither flesh nor spirit, composed entirely of soil and root. Her eyes were empty hollows. Her mouth was wide, open, waiting. The note ended abruptly, the final line smeared by what looked like fingerprints. Only one word could still be read beneath the stain: listening. Winter fell early that year. The ground in Pine Hollow froze solid, everywhere except the Ward Plantation. Snow gathered in every field, on every rooftop. But the soil around that house stayed black and soft, as if warmed from within. The air above it shimmered faintly, like breath on glass. Then came the crying. At first it was faint, a child's wail, distant and irregular, echoing through the hollows at night. But soon it grew stronger. The people in town could hear it through their walls, coming from the direction of the plantation. Mothers woke to find their infants awake, staring toward the sound with wide, unblinking eyes. On Christmas Eve, a midwife named Hester Cole, unable to bear it any longer, rode out toward the noise. She was known for her faith and courage. She'd birthed more children in the county than anyone alive. She told her husband she was going to bring that baby into light. At dawn, her horse returned alone. 2 days later, the crying stopped. The next thaw revealed Hester's shawl in the orchard, stiff with frost. Beside it lay a cradle half buried in the mud. It was woven from vines and roots, knotted tight, pulsing faintly when touched. Inside was something small, and not an infant, not exactly. The shape was human, but its skin was the color of clay, and when its eyes opened, they were gray, unfocused, and hollow. The townsfolk burned the cradle, but it didn't catch. It only smoked, releasing a thick, sweet scent that made them dizzy. When they buried the thing, the earth refused to close over it. By morning, the soil had risen back up, smooth, level, untouched, as though it had been swallowed whole. For the first time in a year, Pine Hollow was quiet. Too quiet. The hymns had stopped. The lights from the plantation no longer flickered. Even the wind that usually moaned through the marshes went still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The people tried to believe it was over. They reopened the church, repaired the schoolhouse, and spoke of the Ward curse as a bad dream fading in daylight. But the silence wasn't peace. It was waiting. The animals knew first. Horses refused to cross the north road. Birds flew in circles, never landing. Wells turned cold, though the fires burned strong in every hearth. And one by one the remaining portraits in town began to change. The faces inside them were fading. Not vanishing, shifting. Smiles replaced sorrow, and each woman's eyes began to look directly outward, as though aware of being watched. Then, one morning, the clock in the courthouse began to chime uncontrollably. 13 times. 14. The sound echoed through the streets, shaking the glass in every window. Children began to hum the old song again, the one from the plantation, not in fear but in joy. When the townsfolk gathered, they found a message nailed to the church door, written in ash. When the air stills, the ground remembers. That night, a storm rose without clouds, and no rain, no lightning, just the deep, rolling sound of thunder from beneath the earth. The ward house lit again, every window flaring bright, and from its open door poured hundreds of pale moths, scattering toward town. Each one carried something written on its wings, faint black letters forming a single word when held to light. Return. The storm came at midnight, but it brought no wind, no rain, only sound. A low, endless rumble rolled through Pine Hollow, shaking walls and splitting trees at their roots. The air shimmered with heat, yet the night remained cold. It was as though the world itself was vibrating, caught between waking and nightmare. Then the singing returned. It wasn't distant this time. It came from beneath the town. The cobblestones pulsed. Dust fell from ceilings. The hymn swelled through every floorboard, every cellar, every inch of ground. The voices were no longer just 7 or 11. There were hundreds now, men, women, children, all singing in perfect, suffocating harmony. When the townsfolk fled into the streets, they saw it, the horizon glowing red, the Ward Plantation pulsing like a beating heart. From the soil rose columns of smoke, coiling together in the shape of human forms, translucent, flickering, writhing in rhythm with the song. Someone shouted that the earth was opening. They were right. The orchard split apart, revealing a spiral of black roots twisting downward like veins into the abyss. At its center, something vast began to rise by neither fully seen nor possible to comprehend. It was shaped like a woman, but her body was made of shifting soil and ash, her face ever-changing, drawn from every portrait, every voice, every buried memory. She opened her mouth, and the thunder ceased. The silence that followed was so deep it pressed on the skull like weight. Then came a whisper and soft maternal unending, "My children, wake." And from the fields, from the marshes, from the graves themselves, the town of Pine Hollow began to move. Not the living, the remembered. They rose not like ghosts, but like sleepers disturbed. From every forgotten plot, every unmarked ditch, figures emerged, pale, clay-coated, eyes sealed as if carved shut. They moved without breath, without sound, swaying in rhythm to the echo of the hymn that now pulsed faintly beneath the earth. The people of Pine Hollow watched, paralyzed, as the forms gathered along the roads, hundreds of them, faces familiar in the moonlight. There was Hester Cole, the midwife who vanished. There were the 7 women from the plantation, still in their tattered gowns, hair woven with roots and moss. Children who died decades ago walked beside men who had hung from trees long since rotted. Each carried something in their hands, a single black seed. When the church bell rang on its own, they began to plant them. One by one, pressing the seeds into the earth, whispering in tongues long forgotten. The soil absorbed each word like a promise. The townsfolk tried to flee, but the air thickened, heavy and sweet like rotting honey. Their limbs grew sluggish, their thoughts blurred, and slowly, one by one, they too began to hum along. By dawn, Pine Hollow stood still. The fields were filled with strange new shoots, dark vines that trembled when touched. The risen had vanished, leaving behind only footprints that sank deep into the mud and refused to fill. In the center of the plantation, the great woman of ash still stood watching. Her face shifted again, until it became that of Mary Ward. Her mouth curved, almost tenderly as she whispered to the dawn, "Now, we are one." The last account of what happened in Pine Hollow came from a traveling preacher named Elias Boone. He arrived 3 days after the storm, expecting to find a town preparing for Sunday service. Instead, he found silence. Not the quiet of sleep, but the hollow stillness of something that had already been emptied. Every house stood untouched. Meals half eaten, candles burned down to wax pools, the church doors wide open, hymns still laid out on the pews, yet not a single soul remained. Boone walked the entire town before reaching the plantation. The fields were overgrown with black vines, the air humming faintly as though the earth were breathing. Inside the house he found the portraits, every one of them, restored. The faces of the 7 women glowed faintly under the dust, their eyes glistening like wet glass. He recorded in his journal that when he passed through the master's study, he saw something written on the wall behind the desk, faint, carved deep into the wood. "She made us whole." He never spoke again after leaving Pine Hollow. Boone was found wandering the road 2 days later, clutching a withered vine in his hand. His tongue had turned black, his eyes milky white, and when the sheriff tried to pull the vine from his grasp, Boone smiled and whispered one word: "Remember." No one goes to Pine Hollow now. The land is fenced off, the record sealed. But on nights when the wind dies and the air feels too still, locals say they can hear the hum again, deep, patient, ancient. And if you listen closely enough, you'll realize something unsettling. It isn't coming from the ground, it's coming from underneath your feet.